There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is your mountain. Well, hello everybody again, and welcome to another episode of the Your Mountain podcast. I am your host, David Wilms. I am joined as always, although I guess last week I wasn't here. So I'm joining Mike and Nephi again. Nephi, how's it going?
It's nice to be back, Dave. It's nice to have you back.
Hey, you were at SHOT Show.
I was.
Yeah.
It's like Disneyland.
Yeah, tell me a little
Only
bit about
better.
it. So tell me a little bit about it. I've never been to SHOT Show.
For those that don't know, it's interesting. It's the trade show for the shooting. It's the shooting, hunting, outdoor trade show. So anything that has anything to do with those things, people go there. 70,000 plus attendees, 1,700 vendors. It's industry only, though. There's actually no selling anything that goes on. It's where basically all the industry folks who are involved in the hunting and firearms world, and then goggles for dogs and embroidered shirts and all sorts of stuff. All those people come together to kind of show their wares and talk business. And so it's just like an opportunity for them to all network.
I think SHOT Show week is the only week that I like social media, because that's the week that everybody on Facebook or whatever is releasing their 2019 whatever product they're doing, which is really neat because you get to see some really cool stuff that's coming out.
And there's a lot of neat meetings there too. So the Congressional Sportsman Foundation gets together, and the Offices of Outdoor Recreation were there, and they got together. And so it gives you a great opportunity to just kind of get a feel for, a lot of what's going on. It's important.
Yeah, and is it always held in Las Vegas?
It is.
Yeah, that's what I thought. It's always there.
It has been for like the last decade plus, and I think there are plans that it's actually growing. Like they turn, like 1,000 different vendors away every year, so they're actually going to grow it next year. It'll grow like 20%. I think it's going to be huge. It's already the fifth biggest convention in Las Vegas. It's going to be the third largest convention in Las Vegas.
Well, I hope as it grows next year that maybe there'll be an opportunity for an invitation to yours truly and Mike truly.
Yeah.
Maybe Your Mountain will work its way there.
Maybe Your Mountain can find its way to SHOT Show next year.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm super tired still.
Yeah, you got back last night, right?
They said if you go through all the booths there, if you were to visit all the booths, like walk up down every aisle, you'd do a half marathon, and that's 100% true.
So did you?
Probably a full marathon.
Yeah, because you had to see everything twice.
Yeah. I was there visiting,
running around.
Yeah, going with people and making sure that they knew where they were going and stuff like that.
Hey, before we get into the topic for today, I wanted to remind everybody, wherever you're getting this podcast, thank you, first of all, for getting this podcast, and wherever you're getting it, can you go out there and do us a favor, do us a solid, give us a rating, preferably a good rating. Maybe that joke gets old. It's not really a joke. It's dead serious. We'd love to have a good rating. It's hearing from folks, seeing ratings, getting comments.
Even
that's
more
the kind of
important than
stuff
that, it's important for us that we have a product that's worth you giving us a good rating. So if it's not worth it to you, don't do it. But tell us why you're not doing it.
So
but if it's worth it, you need to give us. This is how you. This is we're here for the glory.
That's what keeps us going.
Yeah.
We do read them, and
we do.
I think that a lot of folks use that as an opportunity to provide ideas for future podcasts and things in it. And we've taken those ideas and attempted to try to figure out how we can integrate that information and move it forward. And sometimes folks email us with ideas too.
That's true. So, and keep that in mind if you want to send us an email with an idea for a future podcast. Most of the ideas that we've received, most email ideas we've tried to weave into a podcast somewhere. Mm-hmm. I think that's fair to say. Our email address is yourmountain@itsyourmountain.com. So send us an email. Find us on social media at all the handles, the usual places at It's Your Mountain. and like I said, we'd really appreciate the feedback. And with that, so we a couple weeks ago we had a podcast on, we're talking the government shutdown, right? And I think at the time we said this shutdown might last through the State of the Union address.
Well,
now we don't know if we're right or not.
Yeah.
we were just sick of being right. That's how we were like.
I do remember.
So right. We're just tired of it.
Barely remember that.
Yeah,
because I was sick.
You were sick.
Still got a weird voice from that.
But I think when we released that podcast, and that was earlier in January, we said, we think this shutdown might last through the State of the Union address. Well, it just ended, right? People are going back to work. Well, as of this being released, they will have been back at work for a day. I don't know yet as of today if and when we're having a State of the Union address. Agencies are going to be ramping up. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, other agencies within Interior, as well as a whole host of other agencies that we talked about on that podcast, are going to be ramping back up and trying to catch up on a backlog of work from not answering emails, phone calls, or doing their day-to-day job for 33 plus days. And the shutdown affected Congress too, right? I think it's safe to say, and I don't think I'm going out too far on a limb here to say that even though Congress was in session, the shutdown affected their daily routine. What the type of work that they were going to be doing on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. Is that fair to say? Guys, chime in.
Well, they had a lot on their minds. So, I mean, obviously the things that they would have been working on beforehand, those things take a back burner to figuring out the bigger problems. They can't solve, D, E, and F if they can't get A done first. And so there have been...
It also seemed like it became just the issue of the shutdown just sucked the life out of everything else, right? And so that's the number one focus, and it really came down to almost two people having a disagreement, and it it was a who was going to blink first kind of gamesmanship going on. So it's just all the other things that normally you would expect to occur at the beginning of a Congress session. I mean, it's
and optically too, right? Optically, if the government's shut down and Congress and the president are unable to agree on a way to open it up, how does it look if Congress is out there then working on other introduced legislation, having a bunch of really public hearings and so forth on bills that they want to advance that might be affecting those very agencies that are shut down and not receiving appropriations at the time.
Optics are obviously played huge into it, because it became sort of a fight on well, we're not going to have this meeting because that's not fair with everybody not working. Well, let's not do this travel because the federal employees aren't working. They became sort of a weapon in the fight over.
Yeah, and it depends on which side you talk to, and it's a challenging issue, and I say that about way too many things. But
that's your catchphrase. I'm convinced. I'm going to put it on some stationery.
It's a challenging issue.
Nephi Cole. It's a challenging issue
because it's not clean. Like when you look at both sides on this one, there's a real effort to message on both sides, and unfortunately, I think as much as you'd love to think that you can turn on the television and get the reality of it, you just can't.
No,
it's much more complex than that, because you're not really dealing with, the things that they say that you're dealing with. You're actually dealing with some longer standing challenges, and you're more dealing with how people are trying to manage the public perception of what's going on now than anything else.
But it's been interesting to watch. Obviously, none of us have ever experienced anything quite like this, even from a distance, let alone being involved in it. None of us are obviously involved in it on a day-to-day basis, but it's the longest shutdown we've had in U.S. history, and it was obviously a partial shutdown, not total government shutdown, but it was fascinating. It's a fascinating case study. It'll be interesting to see how.
So
history
go back and look
reflects
at our
on it,
last
but-
podcast.
Yeah, yeah.
No, two podcasts
two
ago.
podcasts ago.
Learn all about it.
But yeah, but I guess what I was getting at is typically at the start of a new Congress, both houses are just flying out of the gates trying to get stuff done, right? I mean, there's bills being introduced, there's agendas being laid out, or we got to get everything done before we get into the 2020 presidential cycle, and it feels in some ways like we just lost a month.
Yeah, that's probably true. You think that for many of the bills that they were working on in the previous Congress, they have to reintroduce them because we have a new 2-year Congress, right? First session of the 2-year Congress. And so normally they're putting in things that they were just still working on, and they continue to work on. But there are many of those types of things that had to take a back seat for a little bit.
But that is what we want to talk about today. And I like your very clear segue there,
Yeah,
Mike.
right.
I think that was very crystal clear.
It's about time.
Yeah, right. Because I think what you were getting at is in the last Congress, and this is what we wanted to talk about. In the last Congress, there was a series of sportsmen's-related bills that were working through the Senate in particular and had really, really good bipartisan support. But they just couldn't get across the finish line in time, right? And so fast forward and
saying they couldn't get across the finish line isn't entirely fair. So the act is called the Natural Resources Management Act.
that's what it's called now. I don't know
what it's called last
I don't know what
session.
it's called last session.
But it's worth mentioning that the reason this is going to move very quickly and we're talking about is because all these things were basically agreed to in the last Congress. You had all these things we're about to cover. We're ready to go. They had it already come back from the House, I believe. And so these things were just getting ready to get packaged up in the Senate. The only reason they didn't move is you had one senator, Senator Mike Lee of Utah, put a hold on this bill. And I don't know the particular reasoning behind that. And so I'm not going to guess. But that then left it as a priority item. So now Senator McConnell used a mechanism to be able to have this ready to go in this Congress. So as soon as they get kind of the work that they're working on right now done with the, they're obviously distracted by something else right now. But so this is teed up, ready to go. It doesn't have to go through committee again. This bill can just hit the floor.
Right. Yeah. Just a Senate rule that said we've already pushed it through the committee and worked it up. So now it's just under a general order.
Yeah, and it's an awesome bill.
Yeah.
It is really neat. It's worth people talking about, knowing, understanding, because it represents bipartisan, nonpartisan efforts to move in a great direction for sportsmen, for natural resource management across the country. Lots of people making concessions, coming to consensus. Good things for people on the left hand, good things for people on the right hand, and everybody marching together down the yellow brick road in a nice direction.
Well, I mean, yeah, let's talk about it. I mean, that's what we want to talk about. Let's talk about it a little bit. I'll tee it up by saying, so this was introduced by Senator Murkowski out of Alaska, and I'm trying to remember I think the co-sponsor on that, or first co-sponsor on that is Maria Cantwell, Senator Cantwell out of Washington. But it's got, when I say when you say that this has bipartisan support, there are 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and an independent right now that are sponsoring this legislation. Right, that's about as bipartisan as you can get in the Senate, right, or the House or anywhere, frankly. And so it does have bipartisan support, and as the guys mentioned, it had a ton of momentum in the last Congress. In this Congress, it was introduced as the Natural Resource Management Act.
Senate File 47.
Senate File 47, for those of you that are really wonky and want to go out and pull this thing up. It's a 662-page bill.
I've read it all.
Every last word of it.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Just the words,
Just
it and all.
It and all, yeah. There are dozens of provisions in this bill.
Yeah.
Dozens
There's
of provisions.
a lot.
And we are not going to attempt to touch even a majority of them.
But
It'll be a fraction. We're going to take what
guarantee
we
that
think.
all of you care about this bill and you like parts of it. I promise.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the ones that really stand out as critical for sportsmen, for those that like the outdoors, that want to see this heritage continue and grow.
And that's, I think, keying in on what has been talked about as the sportsman's package.
Right.
So this has many provisions unrelated to sports.
Oh, it has the land exchanges. It's got boundary adjustments for different national parks or recreation areas.
Yeah, new national parks.
National parks.
It creates some new national parks, creates a variety of new national recreation areas,
Wild
conservation
and
areas.
scenic river designations.
And a lot of those in Utah, interestingly enough.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a lot, at least one.
Multiple.
Are there multiple?
Yeah, there's not the wild.
I know there's a lot of
primitive,
stuff
but
in Utah.
We'll
for
put it
sure.
this way: 100% of the wild and scenic river designations in this bill are in
Utah. Yeah,
because there's one.
Because there's one. Yeah.
Yeah, there's San Rafael Swell Western Heritage and Historic Mining Recreation Advisory Area. There's
basically there's a lot of stuff.
A lot of stuff around
600 plus pages that if you want to dive through, you can. There's wilderness area designations.
Designation in National Comedy Center in Jamestown, New York.
There you go.
You've got stuff from stuff from the left coast to the right coast.
That's exactly right.
Like literally on each side.
But let's talk about a few of the things in
and
here.
Alaska.
And Alaska. And Hawaii. I think there's some stuff in there for Hawaii,
congratulations.
too. Especially for volcanoes.
I should check that out.
That's right. Early warning system.
Early warning system, yeah. So let's talk about a few of these. Okay. One easy one to touch on. So a number of years ago, I don't remember how many years ago this was, but there was a big push to allow transport of firearms through national parks. Mm-hmm. For the longest time, you were not allowed to transport a firearm through a national park. That was fixed a number of years ago. But one thing that wasn't was the transport of bows, crossbows, traditional bows, compound bows, whatever, just archery equipment. So one of the things in here would authorize the transporting of bows through national parks as long as they're stored away in a non-usable way at the time. So, cased up and put in a place where they're not accessible. You could then transport them through a national park. That's one of the things in this bill that it's pretty common sense in, as I look at it.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Another one, and this one I think I'm surprised that it's not more controversial. But there's a provision about wildlife management in parks, and in this instance, what they're talking about with wildlife management in parks, we're saying, okay, we're gonna Congress would authorize the Secretary of Interior, who's oversees the National Park Service, would authorize the Secretary of Interior to create a series of regulations to be able to designate volunteers to help with management. And in this instance, management being if the National Park Service, Secretary of Interior, identifies certain species in parks that are over objective, that they need to figure out how do we reduce numbers of this species. They can go through a process to identify volunteers to come in and help with that reduction. And then also there's another piece of that would allow for donation of that food, that protein to folks that could use it, to the volunteers themselves. It would allow for the use of that protein. And I think of a couple examples, and the reason why I could see this becoming controversial at some point. Right? Two parks come to mind right off the bat from where we are in the West. Two parks.
Rocky Mountain National Park.
Boom. Rocky Mountain National Park, elk. Right?
Yeah.
The elk population in Rocky Mountain National Park has been well over objective for a long, long time. They come out of the park and they wreak havoc in Estes Park.
The giant squirrels, because they're everywhere.
Oh my gosh! Yeah. Golf courses, front lawns, out in front of movie theaters and restaurants and
roads.
Yeah, and they can cause some hazards. And anyway, so that's one of them. And then the other one that comes to mind is bison in Yellowstone National Park.
Yeah,
that's an every year issue about. How do you manage the bison herds in Yellowstone National Park? There's controversy because often, and I think this year the proposal is to send about 800 bison in from the national park, round them up and send them to slaughter. So how do you keep that herd within objective? So, and I'm sure there are myriad other examples. Those are two that come to mind. That this piece of the bill would impact that, would address that. You got something you want to talk about too, Nephi, right?
Well, there's a bunch of them. I think those are a couple of small ones, and I think there's lots of small stuff in this act.
Yeah.
But there's lots of big stuff, and that cannot be overstated. So one of the big ones is a major change in national policy, or a statement of congressional policy that says federal land is open to hunting, period. Hunting, fishing, and recreational shooting, unless closed specifically. And so it's basically a declaration of federal declaration that these lands are, that's what they're there for.
Presumed open until said otherwise.
Yeah, and that's big.
Yeah.
That's a big piece of it. And I think that's hugely important to sportsmen. Then there's also reauthorization of the Land and Water Conservation Act.
That was going to be the one I was going to hit next too.
Massive.
And we've done a podcast on that.
We have. That's not a little thing. And so when we're talking about that part of this bill, we have some of these things that are smaller management things like, I'm told, and I haven't found it in here, but there's somebody said this, there's something here that applies to, film crews there's little things, but those are big ones.
LWCF, that expired September 30th, so it's been
and
on the minds of a lot of people.
Absolutely, and we won't hash back through that. Go back and listen to our podcast on LWCF for some of the history of that and the status of the reauthorization and what that means. What this particular reauthorization would do is it would it would put 40% of the funds. A minimum of 40% of the funds would have to go stateside. Yeah. And then a minimum of 40% of the funds would be on the federal side, which is a big deal on the state side because for years and years that percentage has been shrinking and shrinking for what states are receiving to do work on the ground in their states. So coming to an agreement that says we're going to permanently reauthorize LWCF and we'll dedicate a minimum of 40% of those funds, available funds, to the states. That's a big deal.
Yeah. So in addition to that, there's also, we talked about use of federal lands for open for hunting, fishing, recreational shooting. There's also a piece that makes it much easier to develop shooting ranges on federal lands, and kind of running coincidentally with that, there's a section called the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act Target Practice and Marksmanship Training section that allows federal funds, Pittman-Robertson dollars in given states, to be used more leniently for building those shooting ranges. And so that's another piece. So it goes from 75% to 90% is where they can use that. And that's not to be confused with a separate act that's making its way through Congress related to Pittman-Robertson modernization.
Yeah, what's that one about?
Man,
did I put you on the spot?
Yeah, and I can't go into details enough now to be. I could spend an entire podcast talking about it. Maybe we should.
Maybe
at one
we
point.
should. Yeah, maybe we should. There's another piece hidden in this bill, and I probably won't get it all completely correct, but it's one of the things is the idea of making public land available for access, and we've talked about it on other podcasts before about land that is public land, but is completely surrounded by private land and has limited or no access. And one of the things this bill does is it requires the secretary to take a look at that and prioritize these areas where this land is, and prioritize areas that may be trying to secure access as a high priority. Right, and that's a big deal for sportsmen too. And I can't remember what the number is, but I think we talked about how it was Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership working with.
I think it's part of the
Onyx,
LWCF
right?
work on it. You're talking about the specific
number of acres that are right now. Yeah, it's
big.
It's not insignificant. It's
and
not
what's
an
neat,
insignificant amount.
But what's neat is there's a national consensus when you talk to groups that if everybody comes to the table on this respectfully. And so what I mean by that is, respectfully, is as long as I'm not telling Dave that I get to come into his backyard and walk through it to get where I want to go, as long as they're both landowners and conservation groups, hunting groups, everybody who talks about this is they're seeing common ground for doing something about this. And so if we can get people to continue that collaborative, consensus-built, respectful discussion on this, there's a chance this really goes someplace.
Yeah, there's a whole provision in here dealing with sitla lands,
And what are SITLA lands?
You will remember the School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration lands. So that remember when Braden Shepard came on in episode 2?
Yeah.
He worked at SITLA, and he had a lot to do with the management of those state lands. And so there's a whole provision in here on getting BLM and SITLA together in a couple of counties to make some land exchanges, and so it's kind of directing the way that's going to work out.
The big challenge to some of the language in here is and they identify it, they address it in here when you're talking about access. It's finding a way to balance that state management authority, private property rights, and kind of this inherent desire for the public to be able to access their public lands, right? And it's how do you balance those things and identify priorities and best use your resources to try and do something that works for everybody. And I think that's one of the things this bill strives to do, right? Figure out a way to improve access, make things better for landowners out there too. Build partnerships. And in the mind of partnerships, one of the other things this act does is it reauthorize it. That last Congress had what was called the Wild Act, and there were a number of different programs under the Wild Act that were reapproved, reauthorized. One of them, I won't go through all of them, but one of them was the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. And this bill would reauthorize the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. And I can tell you from talking to landowners, a number of landowners, they have valued this program where they can work with the Fish and Wildlife Service and leverage resources to get some conservation work done on the ground that can benefit them as landowners. It can benefit wildlife, and then it benefits those of us that are pursuing that wildlife. Again, that's another thing in this bill, this 660-plus page bill that maybe a lot of people don't know about, but has a lot of positive application in the real world and for helping the sporting community, with opportunities down the road.
Yeah, it's a solid bill. There's another piece. The last piece I want to talk about is the Every Kid in a Park program. So that's for people who aren't aware of that, it's called the Every Kid Outdoors Act, and part of the bill. And what that does is it lets a fourth grader, basically fourth grader and their family, that will ride in a vehicle with them into a national park. It lets them into national parks for free, and that's a really neat opportunity. It's super cool. It's related to hunting, and I'll tell you why. Because studies in outdoor recreation have shown that if people don't get into outdoor rec by the time they're like 16 years old, they're not going to. So if you get people who, by the time that they're, formative teenage years, if those people aren't, outside doing something and, thinking of themselves as outdoors men and women, chances are more than likely they're not going to do that. So that doesn't mean that there's a percentage of them that won't later on, and more people are trying to discover that, but typically there's some piece of their history that's, kind of embedded in that, and they come back to it. Mm-hmm. And it's super, super important that we get kids into the great outdoors at a young age.
Yeah, I think we covered a little of that with Amy, episode 3. Look at that.
Well, it feels like we've been around forever now, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are a couple of states, Wyoming's one of them right now, that's looking at lowering the hunting age for youth for big game. There are some states east of the Mississippi where they don't have an age limit at all, where it's just if you pass hunter safety and you can go out and hunt, you can do everything to pass the class, you can demonstrate it, then you get to go out. And
I don't even know that you have to pass the class. I saw, because they have mentor programs and things, I saw a report, maybe it was last year, maybe it was the year before, I don't remember which, but and I'll probably get the state wrong too, but it was the upper Midwest. It was in the Wisconsin area, but it was like a 3-year-old kid.
False.
Shot at. I don't know.
Let me tell you. I'm going to tell you something, just so everybody knows. You'll hear these, just so we nip this in the bud when people hear these horror stories about this. Because one of the reason you'll go and where people are trying to put these bills into place, people are saying you can't do this because guys are buying, tags for their kids just so they can fill their tags. What the reality is and Dave's probably going to find some National Enquirer story to try and prove me wrong. But remember that there are still laws out there. But what happens is somebody, like, for example, you have a state that has a lifetime hunting license. Somebody buys a hunting license for their 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, whatever.
Brilliant.
And they do that so they can have that for their entire life. And then it gets picked up by somebody in the media who misrepresents it as if.
Well, they don't understand the difference between.
Yeah. And so I just put that caution out there so that people don't suddenly, because these are great efforts in different states. You don't want these efforts coming forward and then the hearsay being, I heard a guy, bought a.
Don't be a Dave.
Hey,
don't be a Dave on this. These are awesome bills. There's a program called Plus One. There's a program called Families Afield. And I come back to the Every Kid in the Park. You got to get people involved in these experiences in the great outdoors when they're young. You can't be selfish about it. Like all of us, we love spending time in the great outdoors with, high adventure type stuff. But man, once a year, take somebody who hasn't gone and done it and take them front country hunting or take them on a hike or take them scouting or something, because these opportunities, if we don't get people involved in them soon, and this bill recognizes that, they're not going to be partakers in that, part of what it is to be an American.
Yeah.
All right, I am gonna correct my prior statement. I'm gonna put an asterisk on it because it wasn't a 3-year-old, but it is Wisconsin.
Okay.
And it was a 6-year-old, so it would have been in 2017. Governor Walker in Wisconsin signed a bill that actually eliminated the age requirement, the minimum age requirement in Wisconsin.
That's what should be done. Parents should be able to make those decisions, knowing the capabilities of their children, knowing their capabilities, and that's a decision that, just like the hunting journey in general, we're all on a different spot. These artificial.
I say good for her. I'm thinking back to when I was 6 though, and I remember, I was shooting like a 22. I couldn't. I mean, I was like 14 before I was a little kid. I was like 14 before I could handle the recoil of a 243.
Yeah.
So man, more power to.
Well, if you're old enough to
her.
sign your name on the hunter safety card, you're old enough to pull a trigger.
Well, pull a trigger is one thing. Want to pull it again? That's another
my
story.
8-year-old, my 8-year-old outshoots Dave right now. So
he probably can take a longer shot than I can. That's for sure. Probably trained in the long shooting arts. Anyway, I digress a little bit. I had to at least point
to be
that.
right. You can't help yourself, can you, Dave? Like
It's
the
so
inability of Dave to be wrong is just. I mean, it's a fact of life that we're comfortable with on the Your Mountain podcast. Is I will note you were wrong though.
I was off by 100%. I said 3, it was 6, but
It
was really an
just say it. I was
I was mostly correct.
Can't do it.
I was mostly correct.
I was misunderstood.
He had the general idea right. It was just the facts.
Yeah. Oh, who needs those facts? If I've learned anything in the past 2 years of national politics,
my goodness,
is that facts are not necessary either politically or by the media. You can just say whatever you want, and so I'm going to start doing that.
God bless you, Dave.
No, but facts are important on the Your Mountain podcast, right? So I wanted to make sure I got that right.
This is a safe space for facts.
That's right.
It was about the importance of everybody on the Your Mountain podcast. It had nothing to do with Dave. It's individual need to be right.
Nothing at all. No. It was just I was protecting the integrity of the show. Anyway. So that was a huge digress, but
it was worth it.
It was totally worth it. It's absolutely worth it. But anyway, so we're not going to belabor this too much more. Follow this bill. This is a really important bill. This is an important bill for the sportsman's community. It has a really good chance at succeeding. And if you want to weigh in, if you want to make your voice heard, reach out to your senator. Reach out to your senator's office and let them know, hey, I support this bill.
And just so everybody knows how to find it, again, it's at congress.gov, and then you can get on that website. It houses all the bills. Just type in S47, Natural Resource Management Act. That same website's a great location for you to identify your your representative, your senators, and if you don't know those already.
You can also track the progress of the bill too,
That's
so
right.
you can know where it is. Who's the committee of jurisdiction? Although in this case it's going to the floor, right? That's what
Right.
we
Yeah.
decided.
Bypass
So
committee.
bypass
Yeah.
committee. That's a big deal. But you can track this, and you can so you can know.
It's so popular right now for everybody for us to pick the things that we don't agree on, and those get all the attention. It's a pity that this thing is not getting more attention because of all that we do agree on.
And I was having a conversation. I want to end it kind of like this. I was having a conversation last week with some folks, and we were talking about how to be effective advocates, right? And too often, and this has been my experience, too often, people only reach out to their elected officials when they have something negative to say, right? They call up to complain about something. They call up to say, you know what, I don't like this bill, or I don't like what you're doing here, or any number of things, right? But it's, I think we've all experienced that. The three of us have all experienced that. Most of the time when the phone rings, it's not to say what you're doing right. It's to say what they think you're doing wrong. Here's an opportunity. Here's an opportunity to pat some of these folks on the back that are doing something right. Right? They need to hear from you that they're doing something right. They're people too. It helps to hear, it helps to hear, when they're doing something right too. So reach out and say, you know what? I like where this is going. I like the bipartisan nature of this. This has some good stuff in here, and I'd like to see you support it.
Who knows? They might like it so much they'll do it again.
Sometimes it's good to be positive, right?
Like all the time?
That's how we are, right?
That's right.
I am positive.
So that's kind of the message I'd like to drive home. You guys have anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's a good point there. And you're absolutely right that most of the time folks hear negative things, but those positive reinforcements, when they're specific, are very important, because a lot of the members of Congress get a pat on the back when they're back in their district, but specific to, I like this particular bill or these provisions for these reasons, as opposed to just general, this is a good bill.
And I'd follow it up with one last thing. If this moves forward and it does pass, follow up again and say thank you. Follow up one more time. So come out now, tell them, hey, I'd encourage you to support this. I appreciate that you're sponsoring it, or I'd like you to add your name to the sponsor list, or at the very least support this. At the end, if this passes, if your senator supports this, reach back out and say thank you. A thank you goes a long way. You'd be surprised. And with that, remember, life is about experiences, so go have one.